Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is 202 Years of Presidential Connections. It is being presented to us today by Park Ranger Joe Korber with the Governor's Island National Monument. Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It is a free series presented every year from January through April. Reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that students and teachers can access them later. Share with us where you are joining from in the chat. If you also be on video, we already have Edgewood on video. So if you're interested in being on video, just leave a message in the chat, and I would love to have you participate with us that way. Okay? So teachers and students, we do encourage you to participate today, whether you are not on screen or not. Please pull up the chat box and enter any comments or questions you have right there. This is the easiest way to ask questions today. We want you to participate because interacting during our session is more fun and the learning experience is more valuable. We ask that you be, though, respectful of our interactive tools and make sure any questions you're asking pertain to what Park Ranger Joe is delivering us today. All right. Thank you again for joining us. We are so glad you have. This is our website if you're interested in more information about our program or you're looking for links to our recordings or any other information regarding our program. Close and turn it over. Joe.
Okay. I see our screens are sharing now. I want to say good morning to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I am Ranger Joe, and I'm coming to you from New York Harbor here in New York City, where in New York City, we have about 8 or 9 different national park sites. And one of them is Governor's Island National Monument. And since this is the P in PPSP stands for presidential, I'm going to come and talk to you today about presidents and their connections to us here in the harbor. I think it's a fun story. It's a long story. We were an Army base. Well, I'm going to tell you right now. So what are the connections? We're going to talk about presidents who may have visited us or even lived here for a long time or a short time. We're also going to talk about presidents who may have made very important decisions that affected the island and the people on the island. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some cool kind of sideways connections because I think they're fun stories. So you'll figure it out yourself. You decide which one we're talking about when we talk about it. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Governor's Island real quick so that you know what we're talking about. It is in New York Harbor in the Upper Bay. New York Harbor is comprised of 2 large bays, the Southern and Lower Bay and the Upper Bay or Northern Bay. And this is a map of New York Harbor. And this is the Lower Bay. That's Staten Island. For you folks who may live nearby, you know that's the Verrazano Bridge would be right there. And this is probably Brooklyn and Queens and in New Jersey. Governor's Island is in the Upper Bay. It's a little island. You'll see the shape in a minute. It's right up there. It's about 3/4 of a mile from the lower tip of Manhattan. I have to ride on a boat every single day to come to work. And when you live in an island like we do here in New York, that shouldn't surprise you. But it does surprise some folks. This is what the island looks like. I've had people say it reminds them of an ice cream cone, this part being the ice cream and this part being the cone. I go with the ice cream cone thing. I think it works out. The older part of the island is here at the top, the ice cream cone part. That's the part of the island that was original, that Mother Nature put there. The southern part of the island was actually built by the Army Corps of Engineers in the early 20th century to make the island bigger. They needed room. Its uses over time. Well, it was a United States Army base from 1794 to 1966. So you could imagine that, yeah, presidents would have a lot of impact on that. It started as coastal defense, New York Harbor, very important place in our early history. You had to defend it, and Governor's Island was in the right place to do that. Later on, because it's in a major port in a major city, it also became a main supply area for the Army, for their operations elsewhere. In big city like New York, you're going to find somebody who wants to join the Army. So it was a great place to recruit. Later, after that, it became home of the United States First Army. It was a very prestigious administrative command, a two-star general living here. And it was still, of course, a main supply base because of the harbor. But the Army left in 1966. They wanted more property, more land to do stuff. So they left their 172-acre island, and the United States Coast Guard took over and lived here for 30 years. It was the largest base in the history of the Coast Guard. There were about 5,000 people living here at one point. After the Coast Guard left, well, that means for us, we got a chance to have a new national monument and a lot more public space here in New York City. So the national monument is 22 acres of the island. It includes 2 historic forts, and the rest of the island is taken care of by New York City, and it's kind of like a big park for folks to come and ride their bicycles, have picnics. We even have a dog run and all kinds of beautiful things going on here all year round now, even in the cold winter. So it's very exciting. And if you're ever in the city, feel free to come and visit, say hello to us. Now, let's talk about presidents. Well, I said it started as a coastal defense base. Who said that? Who made that possible? This guy, President number 1 in our first connection, George Washington. Hey, that's great. If you're going to have your first connection, it might as well be the first president. He was president from 1789 to 1797. And, excuse me, in March of 1794, he signed a bill that authorized the construction of coastal fortifications. At the time, the entire United States was an East Coast country, and our most important assets were our large ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, on down. And the president signed a bill that let them build forts in those places to keep those places safe and to recruit the troops to work in those forts. So they built the first fort here on Governor's Island in around 1794, a fort they called Fort Jay. It was named for John Jay. And that's because, well, President Washington gave us permission. Our next presidential connection would have been this guy, President Thomas Jefferson. He was president from 1801 to 1809. And he signed a law called the Military Peace Establishment Act. Ooh, that's a mouthful. In 1802. But it was really a kind of important law because it created some things that would go on and still exist today in the United States and help develop Governor's Island. One of the first things, it helped create the military academy at West Point. That was important because we didn't have a school for engineers to teach people to build things like forts. We had to find guys who already knew and learn somewhere else. But President Jefferson decided that we should teach our own engineers, and he creates the military academy at West Point. And with all those engineers now being taught and created, he also creates a group called the Army Corps of Engineers, and they still exist today, and they do very important things for both the military and civilians. They are basically soldiers who are engineers. They know how to do not only build things, but fix things. About 13 years ago, we had a big hurricane here in New York City, Hurricane Sandy. And one of the things that happened among all the crazy things is that the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel filled up with water from flooding. And the Army Corps of Engineers, created by Thomas Jefferson in 1802, were the guys who had to pump all the water out. And they figured out how much water that tunnel holds. He didn't tell me how much, though, the colonel, but he knew when he left. The other thing, these engineers would build the forts that we're talking about here. So because of Thomas Jefferson creating the School for Engineers and the Corps of Engineers, we had someone now who can build bigger, better forts here on Governor's Island. Right around the same time this is happening, Great Britain, the folks who used to run the country before the American Revolution, well, they were starting to have problems of their own, and we were getting in their way, and the United States and Great Britain stopped getting along with each other. And the concern was our harbor here in New York was going to be in need of some serious protection. So President Jefferson called upon this man, Colonel Jonathan Williams, to go about not only being the first guy in charge of West Point and the first guy in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers, but he was going to be personally in charge of the project here in New York Harbor, especially on Governor's Island. So he will upgrade Fort J to a star-shaped fort, and he'll rename it as Fort Columbus. It's a big star shape with 25-foot high granite walls right in the center of the island. And his job is to keep the island safe while the other forts do their job. He's also going to build a small fort on the side of the island right across from the city of Brooklyn. They call it South Battery. It's a small fort, and it's because the waterway between Brooklyn and Governor's Island is very small, so he didn't need a big fort there. But then he's going to build on the most important part of the island, Castle Williams. It's named for him. It wasn't a castle like you think about when you hear the word castle. There were no rooms to live in and no towers and knights and things. Folks come in and ask me where the princesses and the dragons are all the time. They called it a castle because of its size and its shape. It was the biggest thing in New York Harbor, and its job was to protect the biggest portion of New York Harbor. It was round, almost a complete circle from overhead in the sky. It looks like Pac-Man, if anybody remembers what Pac-Man looked like, a big circle with an open mouth on one corner. It is 40 feet high. When you're standing next to it or on the roof, when I take people on tours, we are 40 feet above the ground, and it is 200 feet across. It covers about 30,000 square feet and was designed to hold a great deal of cannon, actually 103 of them all together. And if you lived in New York when it was first built, it would have been one of the biggest things you saw. There it is in a drawing from the early 19th century, big round building out there in the harbor. And here's a modern photograph of it. This is what it looks like now. It's still here, and it's part of the National Monument. We take people on tours of the inside and the roof every day, Wednesday through Sunday. And it's a pretty good view, and it's a great little place to visit and see the technology of that period. So that's a lasting impact from Thomas Jefferson. But this is all built between 1805 and 1811. And we said Thomas Jefferson was president until about 1809, which brings us to our next president, James Madison. Now, he takes over from Thomas Jefferson, and he's president from 1809 to 1817. And it's during his presidency that these forts on Governor's Island have the potential of showing their stuff. Because while he's president, the United States is trying to maintain its neutrality in the world and just wants to trade freely with other nations. But England and France are fighting each other, and there's concern that we're getting in the way. And the English start stopping American cargo ships, and they take fellows off the ships who they think are English sailors. It's called impressment. And they're really trying to stop American cargo ships from trading with other countries. And the slogan became free trade and sailors' rights when they talked about how they're going to, push back on what they wanted from England. But it all comes to happen as we're trying to move west. And what happens, of course, is the War of 1812. Now, we talk about that a lot here on the island because it's the big moment for these forts. It's one of the wars in our history that you can never forget when it started because it says it in the name, the War of 1812. And it was a war between the United States and Great Britain. And that would have been our big moment here in the summer of 1814 when the British fleet came to New York Harbor. They were getting ready, and they came and they sailed into the upper bay of New York Harbor, and they looked, and what they found were our forts here on the island, plus a few others around, and nothing happened. The English Navy at that time realized if they tried to attack New York in the summer of 1814, they would have had to face all those cannons in Castle Williams and Fort Jay and all the other forts around the harbor. So they turned around and left, and they went down to Washington and Baltimore. If you all recollect, Washington was attacked by the British in 1814, they even burned down part of the White House. And Baltimore, well, they attacked Fort McHenry there in Baltimore. And that's when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. But New York Harbor, because of the forts here on Governor's Island, because of two presidents making sure they were here, and Jonathan Williams, well, folks in New York read about the war in the newspaper. This was the beginning of a quiet period, believe it or not, on the island and its history. And we wouldn't have to worry about anything too much until this gentleman's presidency. This, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. He was president from 1861 to 1865. Now, we know that possibly as the period during the American Civil War. And it was that period in our history here at Governor's Island where we're going to do a lot and be involved in a lot of different things. The South began to secede when President Lincoln was inaugurated, and they were going to start their own country. That was their claim. And one of the precipitating incidents, one of the things that happened that started the American Civil War was an incident around Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston Harbor, a long way away from here, another fort in a harbor. And the South was telling Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. to get out of Fort Sumter. And Abraham Lincoln was not going to leave Fort Sumter, but Fort Sumter needed reinforcements and it needed supplies. So President Lincoln ordered that resupply. And those supplies left from here at Governor's Island and aboard a steamship called the Star of the West. It went down to Charleston Harbor, and when it got to the entrance of Charleston Harbor, well, the Confederates started shooting at it, and that steamship turned right back around and came back here to New York Harbor. In April of 1861, the Confederates would fire on Fort Sumter, and the Union troops in Fort Sumter would surrender Fort Sumter. Interestingly, those troops would come back here to Governor's Island, and the commanding officer of Fort Sumter, a man named Major Robert Anderson, would bring the flag from that fort here to New York Harbor. He lived in New York City, so he had a report to the base here. And a few weeks after Fort Sumter, in late April, they hung that flag on the statue of George Washington in Union Square Park here in New York City and held a big patriotic rally to get people rallied up and riled up to begin to fight the Civil War. Now, the first big battles of the Civil War would begin in July, the first one being the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. And both sides found out that if you fight big battles, you begin to take prisoners or prisoners of war on a very large scale. And the question was, what do we do with these prisoners of war? Where do we put these guys? And what they decided here in the North is to use the old forts, the forts around New York Harbor, the forts around Boston Harbor, and different places in Philadelphia and such. So the forts here on Governor's Island became temporary POW facilities. Here's a picture of Castle Williams taken by Matthew Brady at the beginning of the war. By then, the Army was putting Confederate enlisted men in the prison. And the problem with being a prisoner of war during the Civil War is that you were very low priority in terms of supplies, things you might need, medicine, food, et cetera, et cetera. And that was on both sides. And it certainly was the case here on Governor's Island. Also, well, there were overcrowding because you would have suddenly lots and lots of prisoners. You couldn't make the castle any bigger. And there was poor sanitation because you had to keep all these guys crowded in a small space. And the results of all of that was many guys got sick while being prisoners, and some of them passed away. And it was a tough thing to be during that war, to be a prisoner of war. Interesting enough, though, the Civil War would be the beginning of the castle's 100 plus year prison history. After the war, the Army would decide that the castle would be a pretty good jail, and it went from being a coastal fortification to a Army jail, and it would be an Army jail until 1966. Now, our next connection, number 5, fellow named Ulysses Grant. And you probably thought about a little bit about him if you were thinking about the Civil War. This is what he looks like. He was the general of the Northern or Union or United States Army that won the war. But he was also president of the United States from 1869 to 1877. He was our 18th president. And he is a West Point graduate, career soldier. And early on in his career, he was sent here to Governor's Island. He actually was sent here because he had to wait here for a ride to his next big job, which was out in the Pacific Northwest, a place called Fort Vancouver. And the way people used to get there back then was to take a boat on the East Coast down to Panama, walk across Panama, get on another boat, and take that up the other side to the West Coast. And well, Ulysses had to wait here for that. He was already married, but he sent his wife Julia home. She was expecting their first son, and he didn't want her to come along. So he was here. He lived in a building about 50 yards from where I'm sitting right now. Wrote a little bit about it. And when he finally got that ride, well, he had one of the toughest journeys you can imagine. He left here with recruits, and off they went to the Pacific Northwest. Later on, by the way, and this is a sidebar, his oldest son, a fellow named Frederick Grant, would be assigned here as commanding officer twice in the beginning of the 20th century. And his grandson, named Ulysses III, would also serve here on Governor's Island. Lived in another building not far from where I'm sitting, and he was chief of staff of the 2nd Service Corps area. So it seems like the Grants had a lock on this place. There were a lot of them over time, starting with, of course, Ulysses. My next connection is one of those funny connections, one of those weird ones, but I think it's kind of cool. The president in question was James Garfield. James Garfield was president from just in 1881. He wasn't president very long. And he never served here. He was a veteran, but he didn't serve here. He would be the 18th president of the United States. Well, that's wrong. He would have been I think the 20th. His opponent, though, when he ran for office, was a fellow named Winfield Scott Hancock. This guy. And that's the connection. This guy, Hancock, He was running for president while he was still a major general in the army, and he was assigned here to Governor's Island while running for office. He lived right here, right across from my office in a building, the commandant's house. And it's amazing that he could run for president and be in charge of the Eastern Atlantic Division of the U.S. Army at the same time. But back then, presidents didn't travel around. Well, they didn't have to talk on television, stuff like that, because there was none. And they didn't travel around and campaign for themselves. People campaigned for them. So General Hancock could stay here in New York City, and other people would go and give speeches about, on his behalf. And it sounds kind of weird to us because we're used to something very different. But in the long run, it was a very close race. Uh, General Hancock and President and Mr. Garfield were very close in the amount of popular votes, although Mr. Garfield won a great deal of the electoral votes. Um, Unfortunately for Mr. Garfield, President Garfield, he would win, but only be president from March 1881 to September 1881. And he would, after that, uh, he would be assassinated by someone who was actually looking for a job and thought that Garfield was ignoring him. As for General Hancock, the story goes that when he lost the election, when the telegram came through, he was asleep. It was late at night, and his aide knocked on his bedroom door and woke him up to tell him he lost the re-election. And it is said that, well, General Hancock said, "Oh, well," and went back to sleep. And he served out the rest of his army career, not the president here, but still here on Governor's Island.
Ranger Joe
Yeah.
from Galileo STEM Academy. Why was Garfield not president very long?
He was shot by an office seeker in September of 1881.
Hmm.
And it's not a story we hear a lot about because his presidency was so short. So, like we know that Abraham Lincoln was shot, and we learned out later about John Kennedy and even William McKinley. But President James Garfield was shot, and it, he eventually died of that bullet wound. He didn't die right away, but it was a very interesting story because the man who shot him was actually a person who thought that he was going to get a job from President Garfield, and apparently President Garfield didn't even know who the guy was, and the guy got very upset about the whole thing, and that's what happened. And it's interesting when you think of if General Hancock had actually won the election, what would have happened? And because President Garfield is a New York connection, when President Garfield was shot, his vice president was a man named Chester A. Arthur, who didn't get along with President Garfield. Vice presidents and presidents didn't necessarily talk to each other in those days. So Vice President Arthur lived in New York City. He had nothing to do, so he stayed home in New York City. And when President Garfield died, they had to send to New York City because now Chester Arthur was the new president. He was actually sworn into office here in Manhattan on 23rd Street and Lexington Avenue in his home there. And there's a little plaque on the building where that happened. But yeah, he wasn't expecting to be president that day for sure. But things were kind of weird and slow back in the 19th century. Okay. Oh, and the next one up is one of my favorite presidents.
Wait,
This
Ranger
guy.
Joe?
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Galileo also said it's crazy to think that it was faster to sail down and walk across Panama and then sail than to
Yeah.
travel.
Well, at the time of that, thanks to this guy, we have the Panama Canal. But before him, there was no canal. So if you had to sail to the West Coast, you had to go all the way down to the bottom of South America and then all the way back up. So somebody said, well, if we just walk across Panama, that'll be quicker and get on another boat. And it might have been quicker, but that walk across Panama could be very dangerous. Panama was a subtropical country. In fact, in a situation with Grant, President Grant, when he was Captain Grant, he and his recruits that he was bringing with him, actually, some of them got very sick. because of malaria and things like that. And it was a really, really tough journey from one side of Panama to the other. And he was very, very lucky that he sent his wife Julia home, because she was expecting their first child, and walking across Panama might not have been very good for her. But this guy, among all the other things he did, is one of the reasons we don't have to walk across Panama anymore. This is, of course, is President Theodore Roosevelt, the man who brought, among other things, the Panama Canal. Uh, I love President Theodore Roosevelt. I worked at his birthhouse for many years, and last year I did a presentation about him and his time in the Rough Riders. Teddy, as the press called him, was president from 1901 to 1909. And during that time, he did an incredible amount of things. He was the first president to consider the environment as an important part of our life here, and made it a presidential issue. And he was a lot of, a lot of people think he created the National Park Service, which he didn't, but he was probably definitely one of our biggest fans. Well, I'll probably get a little bit more into that near the end. But I want to talk a little bit about his connection to us, which is one of those cool, interesting connections that I find is a great story. His connection begins with the guy here on the left, the gentleman on the left, this officer. This is General Leonard Wood. Leonard Wood was a good friend of Theodore Roosevelt going back to the 1890s, when Theodore Roosevelt was a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Captain Wood at that time was working at the White House. He was the physician. He was a doctor. He was President McKinley's doctor, and he was the doctor of many of the members of the cabinet. And he and Roosevelt got along very well. Leonard Wood was a West Point graduate, and he had a medical degree. Very interesting combination. And when the Spanish-American War began in 1898, Theodore and Leonard, best buddies, decided they wanted to go join the. Well, Leonard was already in the war, in the army, but Theodore wanted to join the army, and he wanted to go fight the war together. In order to do that, they had to help start what became known as the Rough Riders. So they served together in the Rough Riders of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, and that made Theodore Roosevelt very famous, and is probably one of the reasons why he would eventually get elected president of the United States. But they maintained their friendship for the rest of their lives together. After Roosevelt was finished with his presidency, Leonard Wood was still in the service, and he was the commanding general here. He lived in the same house that Winfield Hancock lived, and Freddie Grant and all those other guys. And one day he invited Theodore and Mrs. Roosevelt here to Governor's Island for lunch. That day was February 18th, 1917, which is right around President's Day or Washington's birthday. And it was a big deal because Roosevelt was still an important person, even though he was a retired president. They called Roosevelt Colonel, by the way. That was his nickname. And there's a little snippet here of an article from the New York Times. It says, Colonel Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt came to New York from Oyster Bay yesterday, and for part of the afternoon were guests of General Leonard Wood at Governor's Island. So TR was sitting right here having lunch with General Wood. When Colonel and Mrs. Roosevelt left the island on a tugboat, they were accompanied to the Battery seawall by General Wood, and where the general and the former president shook hands and parted. And just before he and Mrs. Roosevelt went away in an automobile, Colonel Roosevelt said to reporters, now there were a lot of reporters because Roosevelt was a very interesting guy, even though he wasn't president at the time, but he'd been one of the most famous Americans of his era. So when the press heard that he was in New York City having lunch with his old buddy, General Wood, here at Governor's Island, they wanted to know what they talked about. And Roosevelt told them what they talked about. I'd been to Governor's Island and have seen the airplanes. They used to test airplanes here on Governor's Island back then. And I saw the rookies drill with broomsticks. And and their wonderful patriotism that was filled with wonder and then shame at the great people like ours should be in such a state of unpreparedness. So the thing was, the First World War was going on at the time. And Roosevelt, even though we were not involved in the war yet, thought that we should be preparing just in case. And he would talk to the press constantly about this, and Wood believed the same thing. And the thing is, Wood, he kind of tricked Roosevelt into talking to the press that day about that subject because he knew Roosevelt's voice would carry more weight than his voice. The rookies that Roosevelt talks about in this newspaper article were civilian guys who went to training camps in Plattsburgh during the summer on their own time and learned how to drill. They were kind of like National Guard or reservists, and that's what he was calling them. They drilled, and they called them, Plattsburgh is a way upstate New York. And a lot of guys were involved, including Roosevelt's four sons. They all took part in that program as well. And they drilled in civilian clothes in front of Roosevelt. And instead of rifles, they were using broomsticks, which seemed cool, but at the same time showed, well, there was a little bit of a lack of concern about what kind of equipment they had. And all these got Roosevelt's dander up, of course. And when he got a chance to talk to the press, he gave them his opinion for sure. He was happy to see them drilling, but he was sad to see they didn't have the equipment they needed. And he told the press as much. And that was probably the last time TR got to visit Governor's Island. President Wilson was not happy about that day, that little incident that day for sure. But that's
Ranger
our
Joe,
Korean. Yeah,
to interrupt you again. One of
that's
our
all right.
guests, one of our guests has mentioned that there's going to be a Rough Rider reunion in Oyster Bay this spring, May 31st through June 1st. Do you know anything about that?
Okay, so besides, I worked at Theodore Roosevelt's birth house here in Manhattan. Roosevelt was born on East 20th Street in New York City in 1858, and he lived in a house on East 20th Street for 14 years. When he passed away, his family had that house rebuilt, and it became the first museum dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt. In 1962, that house in Manhattan and his adult home in Oyster Bay, Long Island, became part of the National Park Service. So you can visit the home that Theodore Roosevelt spent his adult life in Oyster Bay. It's called Sagamore Hill. And if you ever visit Oyster Bay, and I do, I live here in New York City, and I live in Queens, which is on Long Island. And on my days off, sometimes in the summertime, especially, me and Mrs. Corbett will take a ride out to Sagamore Hill because it is a beautiful place. And the town of Oyster Bay is a beautiful little town on the North Shore of Long Island. And when Theodore Roosevelt lived there, he loved where he lived, and everything in the town was important to him. So when you walk around Oyster Bay and you visit Sagamore Hill, there's Teddy Roosevelt everywhere. And they have Teddy Roosevelt events. And there are a group of people here on Long Island who all own horses that will gather at a historic site related to Teddy Roosevelt, and they'll put on the uniform of the Rough Riders and the equipment of the Rough Riders. And they have what they call a living history demonstration where they'll show you the things that the Rough Riders used and how the Rough Riders were trained and all these other things. And it's a really pretty cool event if you do get a chance to see that. Absolutely. Teddy Roosevelt's such a great story and so important to our history and certainly the history of the National Park Service. Absolutely.
So I see that the Stephen Gilroy group that asked that question is telling us now that can you see that he says he's a park ranger or was a park ranger and now a volunteer at Sagamore Hill, and they're trying
Ah,
to get descendants to attend. Actually, that would be really cool if you could do that.
I've met a
No,
few.
we segued a little bit here, but I fascinating.
I've had the opportunity to meet uh, descendants of Theodore Roosevelt, and in fact, I just recently took a class on constitutional amendments and Reconstruction in the United States post-Civil War, and the teacher was Kermit Roosevelt III, the great-great-grandson of Theodore
Awesome.
Roosevelt. So that was pretty cool. It's very cool.
Let me interrupt with those comments from our
No,
attendees.
that's super. I'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt all day if you want. Well, we're on to another president. On to another president. Who we got? Oh, we have a more modern era. We have President Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan loved this place. Governor's Island was so convenient because if a president was coming to New York, this was still a military base. And when Ronald Reagan was president, this was a Coast Guard base, and there was a lot going on. For example, in 1986, it was the anniversary of that statue back there behind President Reagan, Statue of Liberty. He was president, of course, from 1981 to 1989. And he came to visit us here. It was still a Coast Guard base in 1986 because the Statue of Liberty had been covered up and being renovated for almost 2 years up to that point. And it was going to be unveiled in its restored beauty in the summer of 1986 on its anniversary. They had a Liberty Weekend here. And it started on July 3rd, 1986, and it was going to run through the whole weekend. They had a parade of ships, all kinds of amazing speakers and things. The president of France, Francois Mitterrand, came here to meet with President Reagan, of course, because it was France that gave us the Statue of Liberty originally in 1876. So there was a lot going on here on the island. I meet people who lived here and they remember all this happening right here where they lived, and it was pretty exciting for them all. President Reagan was here for the unveiling and a couple of speeches, and they pushed they had this big thing set up, would look like a giant red button, and they pushed down on it as a kind of symbolic turning on of a switch. And when they pushed it on, the Statue of Liberty was lit up by then very state-of-the-art LED lights. For the first time in 2 years, people saw the restored Statue of Liberty with its brand new torch. So that was pretty cool. And I remember it too. I won't say I was a kid, but I was much younger when that happened. But I do remember it. And you can see now when you visit the Statue of Liberty, another national park site here in New York Harbor, the old torch, the original torch. It's in a museum, which is brand new on the island. And you'd have to look up at the lady's arm to see the new torch. But we were here when that thing was unveiled, and the man who unveiled it was President Reagan. President Reagan gets two notions here, two mentions here. The second one is along with his successor, George H.W. Bush. And here's a photograph of President Reagan and President Bush and a third man. That third man is Mikhail Gorbachev. And this happened on December the 7th, 1988. They're standing on Governor's Island in this photograph. It was the end of Ronald Reagan's second term, and George H.W. Bush had just been elected president. He was president-elect. He would be inaugurated a month later in January of 1989. And those two gentlemen came to meet with this gentleman. He was the premier or president of the Soviet Union, the USSR. They met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev here. Mr. Gorbachev had been at the United Nations giving a speech, and Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had met several times during Reagan's presidency, and they became friends, and they worked together to end what we called the Cold War at that time. And this was their last chance to meet while President Reagan was still President Reagan. So Mikhail Gorbachev was in New York City. President Reagan arranged to meet him here on Governor's Island, where it would be convenient for all. And they would have a meeting here. This is the study or parlor of the commanding officer's house here on Governor's Island. And you can see Mikhail Gorbachev, President Reagan, and President-elect Bush, and they're having a little bit of a talk. This is, of course, the press listening in, hoping to figure out if they hear something. And then after the little press conference, they had lunch together in the main dining room of the commanding officer's house here on Governor's Island. And I've taken people on tours of that house. It's been a while since I've had the opportunity to go in that house, but I've stood there where that picture was taken, and it's pretty cool to be able to do that. And for the people who lived here when this was going on, it was a very exciting period. Absolutely. Uh, having both President Reagan and President-elect Bush here on Governor's Island. Now we're going to get into a more modern era. I want to talk about these two presidents, William Jefferson Clinton and George W. Bush. They're important to us, not necessarily because they visit us, but because of what we are now, a national monument. These two presidents are the reason we are a national monument here in New York Harbor. Bill Clinton was the first president on January 19th of 2001 to declare or proclaim the establishment of Governor's Island National Monument here. And his original declaration called for the 2 forts here on Governor's Island and about 20 acres total. At the time, the Coast Guard was leaving, so no one knew what was going to happen on Governor's Island. But President Clinton wanted to make sure that the forts were protected. So whatever else happened on the island, those forts were always going to be here for people to see. He did that in 2001. And then his successor, George W. Bush, in February of 2003, revisited the original proclamation. Presidents can do that. And this was after 9/11, of course. By then, the island was going to be turned over to the city of New York as public space. So President Bush made sure that that part of the island that had the historic forts would remain separate as a national monument. So he kind of added on to President Clinton's original proclamation and created the 22-acre footprint that is now Governor's Island National Monument. So he actually gave us a little more space, which is cool. And it was a continuous space. So you can walk from one fort to the other and always be walking in a national monument, which is kind of fun too. And this let the city do whatever they had to do on the rest of the island, which is create things for folks to do, while we here at the National Park Service preserve the 22 acres set aside by the two proclamations. And the reason they could do that, I'm going to go back to this guy, Theodore Roosevelt. He gets a lot of love here. He was, Theodore Roosevelt, the first president to be able to create national monuments. And it was because of a law that he signed into being, the American Antiquities Act of 1906. And as I printed here, Section 2 states that the President of the United States is hereby authorized in his discretion to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated on lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments, and may reserve as part thereof parcels of land, the limits of which in all cases should be confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. In simple terms, he gave presidents the power to turn special places into protected special places. As President Theodore Roosevelt himself created 18 national monuments, including a place called the Grand Canyon. Some of those national monuments later on would become national parks, but a lot of them stayed national monuments. The very first national monument, again created by Theodore Roosevelt, the Devil's Tower in Wyoming. It remains a national monument to this day. And because of him, other presidents have been able to do the same. So because of this president, 2 other presidents were able to create Governor's Island National Monument and protect and preserve the 2 forts here on Governor's Island that it's my job and my colleagues' job here to tell the story of. So if you're an island that's a military base, and then later on has a national monument on it, the actions of and the ideas of presidents are often going to have an impact on the people that lived here through history and and the people that still come here regularly. So I can give this talk maybe 20 years from now when I'm a little bit older, and it probably add a lot more to it. But for now, that's the fellows I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. I don't know how much time we.
Question, is there a visitor center on the island?
When you come to visit the island in the summertime, I should 3/4 of the year, spring through autumn, through the end of autumn, you come to Castle Williams, you'll find a park ranger, and we will help you out. We're here Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. If you come in the wintertime on those days, you go to our website and give us a call, let us know you're coming, and we'll meet you here. Because we don't have heat in the castle yet. Who knows? That might change. But we're always here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Absolutely. You need a stamp, you need a tour, you want to answer a question, you want to take a walk around. The island's open. The whole island's open 365 days a year. So even if we're not here, you can come and take a walk around. You just can't talk to us, and that's the best part, I think.
Question.
Oop, yeah.
From the first president to current, it's like connecting our history and the continuation of our history. It's kind of unique, you know. I don't know. I see it that way.
No, I, yes. I mean, as a country, we are unique in that we've managed this for 200 and, let's see, well, we're celebrating our 250th anniversary as a nation, but we've had presidents for about 240 of those some odd years, and that's pretty special, I think. That it's interesting. All 47 have interesting stories. Absolutely. Oops.
See any more questions here? So go ahead and close out. Is that
Okay. There you
I
go.
want to thank you, Ranger
Somebody
Joe.
asked me how long I've been a ranger.
Oh,
I
there.
will tell them that. There you go. I've lived in New York City all my life. And in fact, this past Tuesday was my 61st birthday. So that's how long I've been here. I worked for New York City for a long, long time. I was a school teacher and I was in law enforcement. And when I retired from that, I became a park ranger because I thought that would be a really, really fun and interesting thing to do. And you know what? I was right. So I've been a park ranger for about 14 years, mostly here at Governor's Island. And thank
there.
you, Sharp, for the happy birthday.
It's awesome being 61, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's
I hit that later this year. So welcome 1964 babies.
there you
Yeah.
go. We know what's up. We've seen it all.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending
All
today's
right, thank
session. We
you.
appreciate your participation and your thoughtful questions today. Ranger Joe, thank you very much for your time and your great presentation. And I will see you at the 2 o'clock. You want to come on about 1:50? That would be great.
All right, will do. See you later.
Okay, take care. Bye everyone. We'll
Bye
see you
bye.
again soon.